Well, this is a real difficult video to get out, just one issue after another. And when we get them all solved, something else pops up. But we've been following the earthquake cluster in California. It's occurring in a region halfway between Las Vegas and Bakersfield. It's a region where the Great Basin encroaches into California and mountains start to intrude upon the Great Basin. These earthquakes occurred in a basin or a valley near the transition zone where the valley floor starts to slope upwards. When you have subsidence in your basin, that's where you impart the most stress. 2 days ago, the number of brand new aftershocks was limited and looked like a typical tapering off of an earthquake in terms of magnitudes and numbers of aftershocks. And they extended along a fault line and along the edge also of this basin. But then within 24 hours ago, we had thousands of brand new aftershocks. Amazing. And this is just a fraction of the ones that occurred, because most of these are greater than 2.5. But when you count the 1.5s, there are thousands of earthquakes just in the last 24 hours along that region. Makes you wonder what's going on. The magnetosphere is putting out energy, and a lot of people try to connect the sun to earthquakes and volcanism. But one thing, when you do that, you forget about what's actually happening, and that is a very intense background X-ray level and even other forms of radiation like extreme ultraviolet and gamma radiation. The reason we know extreme ultraviolet is created in our magnetosphere as well as in the sun's magnetosphere is that a lot of times we pick up higher levels beneath our magnetosphere. So that tells you it's being created in the magnetosphere, not beyond the magnetosphere, where the readings tapered off. But they're still picking up ultraviolet C coming from the sun. But this magnetosphere simulation measures energy in joules. And since December, we've been tracking this instrument, and the light blue was always surrounding us, light blue, and slowly but surely, as we've made our way around the sun, the little planet Earth is now surrounded by yellow and red much of the time. That's a much higher energy level than we've been covering, and it's forming at some of these rings are forming at geosynchronous orbit and beneath geosynchronous orbit of our satellites, not just out where our magnetosphere bow shock zone is. So we're seeing some turbulence at the north and south pole of the magnetosphere shock zone. And that turbulence is not created by particles, it's created by magnetism. It's the north and the south pole influencing the shape of our magnetosphere. Normally this does not happen, but because of the number of electrons flowing through the magnetosphere, in the magnetosphere, and in the magnetic field lines themselves, when you have a greater concentration of electrons, you have greater voltage. When you have greater voltage, you have greater electromagnetism. So these are falling into the influence now of our north and south pole, and we're actually tugging at our magnetosphere quite repeatedly now, causing distortions both in the north and the south regions of our magnetic bow shock zone. This is still wreaking havoc with our satellites. Many satellites are still switching on and off safe mode, kind of like a circuit breaker, protecting you from a surge. And therefore, it's pretty evident when the sun's putting out 0 protons that what you're seeing is mostly electrons. And to confirm this, we must go to an instrument that is designed specifically to measure the electrons, not just the energy created by the electrons, not just the way the electrons affect the shape of your bow shock zone and your magnetic field, but actual measuring of electrons. The very interesting things happen here. First, the electrons are pulsing in, usually in couplets. Not always, but usually. That's a strong indication they came from helium and were ionized off of helium. Then we see intrusions along the tail zone. We see almost a near and complete saturation that suddenly disappears. Well, there's some hours cut out of this simulation, as usual. And then as the electrons swing around to the right side of the simulation and face the sun, the whole magnetic field shifts that way for a moment. And it's because we had a stronger magnetic field, more electrons. And what's off to the right that could oppose the sun's wind? And the magnetic field created by the sun, the interplanetary magnetic field is what they call it, and that's a moving magnetic field that chases after the solar wind. Well, what happens when the solar wind is really, really weak? You have very little of that, either by meeting resistance or the fact there's no coronal holes and no CMEs, and a very dense ring of particles around the sun that's going to create resistance to anything coming in and leaving the sun. But these electron signatures are very strange, and they're spiraling in, but had they just give us a little more of the simulation, we might be able to affix where these electrons were actually coming from. But they're coming from roughly the sun, but they spiral in, and so that's why it always looks like they're coming in from behind the Earth. But this total saturation that then rings around to the 3 o'clock position is like a giant magnet at the 3 o'clock position. And if there was a brown dwarf also off to the right, you would have two magnetic fields competing with the sun's interplanetary magnetic field. And when that became so weak and the electrons became situated correctly, you saw the entire magnetic field just shift in the blink of an eye. That's not from particles coming from the left. That's from a magnetic attraction on the right, a connection. This I want to spend some time on because this perfectly explains what's happening to all the planets, what's happening to our ice, what's happening to our oceans, and what's relationship to carbon dioxide. First of all, this is a measure of the troposphere, the temperature of the troposphere, which is surface temperatures. The surface temperatures in red, the very top is carbon dioxide. Look at the carbon dioxide for this very short time span. I have to admit it's not huge time span, but it's enough to give us a statistical relevant data set. And the carbon dioxide doesn't appear to affect very frequently the tropospheric temperature. Rather, if you were to look at atmospheric temperature, you would probably see a stronger correlation between carbon dioxide levels and atmospheric temperatures. But the troposphere is less prone to air and less prone to fluctuations. But when you look at the blue lines, now this is crazy. The blue lines are measuring cosmic rays that are not coming from the sun, but coming from space. And it's space that's helping to melt the ice, not just the sun. This article specifically talks and goes in detail about neutral helium, how it penetrates right through our magnetosphere. Why? Because it carries no charge. It's not influenced by a magnetic field. It's neutral. And so when you look at the correlation between the tropospheric temperature and the helium coming in and the cosmic rays making it through the magnetosphere, you see a very strong correlation to that, and which is bizarre because they use the word intergalactic, but we now know it's interplanetary. Almost all of this stuff is being created within our own solar system. At least half of all background X-rays are created within our own planetary system. Well, so naturally this would be warming all the planets, because as the cosmic rays get through and warm the troposphere, well, that passing through the corona of the sun itself creates all kinds of energy in the corona, so the sun is hotter too. So we're getting radiation off the sun and cosmic rays from outer space combining to really cook the planet. And there's no doubt the planet is cooking. What breaks down the discussion is when carbon dioxide is held as the villain. So this process that's going on, the melting, the heating, the penetration of cosmic rays, the cosmic rays lighting up the corona, and also creating collisions in our own magnetosphere, releasing even more types of photon radiation. We must be truthful about the cause of all this heat. And when you're not, it makes you wonder if the powers that be that can make decisions like how to save the planet are being lied to, or are they orchestrating the disinformation? One way to survive this kind of environment for the next 10 years is to live underground. Makes you scratch your head. And shade is really our biggest friend. And the more shade, the better. But what's happening now is people are being driven out of the sun, and they're having low vitamin D3 levels. So if you're having nerve pain and low immune response and you're getting sick all the time, vitamin D3 is probably low. And if you're having significant symptoms, you're probably critically low. And I would place a bet that's 70% of the people with neuropathy and a poor immune system. But what happened in the last 24 hours? Thousands and thousands of aftershocks after tapering off. And so people try to draw a correlation between what's happening on the sun and what happens to our volcanoes. And when you talk about volcanoes, you also have to talk about earthquakes. So they're drawing the correlations between the sun and earthquakes, the sun and volcanoes. And a lot of very complicated theories are out there. But the least complicated theory is the one that is explained with the fewest amount of variables. And that's the one that is almost always right. So you can argue all day whether the sun's causing volcanoes, but so all of these would be symptoms of a single cause.